Yeah, until the 7th grade, they called me Danny, so feel free to do that as well. First of all, Richard, thank you very much. And I've told Richard now several times, really in just a short time, several months, not only to assume the position of President of the AZM, but to assemble this two-day conference really is quite something, and I take my hat off to him as I always do. I am an alumnus of AZM, actually of AZF. Some of you may remember, there are a few in the room. I actually was the director of the Boston office of the AZF, and I also directed something called Zionist House in Boston, which was a townhouse that housed all the Zionist organizations. So this is one of my original homes, and I'm glad to be back here. Just one thing about the Balfour Declaration, because it was all around us here today. Very proud of the role that B'nai B'rith played in helping to bring the Balfour Declaration into existence. As it turns out, Chaim Weizmann was once the president of the Manchester Lodge of B'nai B'rith, so our roots really are very deep on the Balfour Declaration as well. I'm going to go quickly because the buses are coming, and because you've been here all day, and we want to make this brief, but also to the point. I want to begin with 3 personal reflections. When I was in graduate school, I wrote a paper on the Maccabean, the magazine of the Federation of American Zionists, which was a forerunner of the AZM. Founded first in New York at the end of the 19th century, and then I think in 1901 it broadened out to the rest of the country. The magazine featured articles written by leading activists, thinkers, and poets about all manner of subjects relating to Zionism. In the back of every issue, listed by city, were contributors to the Zionist movement, donors. I was delighted to find in my research that every month, for a period of years, under the heading of Bangor, Maine, because this was all done by communities, under the heading of Bangor, Maine, my uncle Jonah Wallace contributed $3 a month. Wow. That was about 1910. The other gifts, by the way, were 50 cents, so if that stood out. Also in 1913, and also in Bangor, my mother, speaking at the inauguration of the new building of Congregation Beth Israel, was chosen to speak on behalf of the community's young people. In her short presentation, she said, as reported in the Bangor Daily Commercial newspaper, "We look upon our synagogue as the fortress and the pillar of Judaism. Our purpose is to once more uplift the Hebrew flag without wishing in any way to detract from the greatness of, or letting in any way affect our allegiance to, the Stars and Stripes. We hope to make ourselves deserving of the greatness of our ancestors and worthy of taking our place as standard bearers of our nation." And the our nation in this case was the Jewish people. In the same year, in Russia, my father, just into his teenage years, was about to leave Russia for the United States. He told me that a picture of Herzl was placed somewhere in their home in the shtetl. And he also told me that on the night before their departure, as they made their way to get the boat, probably a train to get the boat, he told me that he had made a pact with his best friend. They would meet again in Palestine, they agreed. Not in America, not in New York, and not sometime. It would be in Eretz Israel. Well, when my uncle was contributing to the Zionist movement, and my mother made that short speech, and my father and his best friend were agreeing to meet again in the Jewish homeland, it was 4 years before the Balfour Declaration, and 35 years away the creation of the establishment of the State of Israel. But the common denominators of these 3 seemingly random stories was the fervent hope that a modern Jewish state, the vision of Herzl, would one day become a reality. Of course, there were different versions of how to achieve that end, and those differences sometimes boiled over into controversies and feuds. There were seemingly insurmountable obstacles to overcome over the years. including, but not only, a mandatory power in Great Britain, which itself veered from the policies which they instituted in the Balfour Declaration. They locked its doors just when European Jewry needed it most. What could have been a haven for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews fleeing the Nazis, became a no-go zone for most. And even after the war, when Holocaust victims' tattoos on their arms sought to create new lives for themselves, thousands were interned in Cyprus. Others sailed to within sight of Palestine's coastal plain, only to be summarily turned back. The establishment of the modern Jewish state, though fractious in its political makeup itself, bound diaspora Jews abroad together. In my lifetime, and in the lifetime of most of you, the list of challenges to Israel's existence from the regular armies of its neighbors and from terrorist organizations is a long one. I was 7 during the Suez War, but old enough to see my parents concerned about our relatives in Israel. I was a high school senior when the Six-Day War took place, hearing my classmates praising the quick Israeli victory and saying, and I remember this as if it were yesterday, how you guys are really beating the Arabs. I was just into my first job in the Jewish community in Boston when the Yom Kippur War broke out, and only days later learning that a cousin of mine had fallen on the Golan. And there was Lebanon with the PLO and Fatah land, the 2 Gaza wars, and so much more. I don't know exactly when the tide turned, where praise and admiration turned to full-scale campaigns to demonize, marginalize, undercut, and delegitimize Israel began. Surely, the United Nations has been home to bias against Israel from the very beginning. First, the PLO and its political successor, the Palestinian Authority, have, together with friends, not only from the Arab and Islamic world, but in Europe and other places as well, have been the driving force behind much of this. We've talked for years about the turnabout on American and university campuses, leading to the BDS issue and other issues that are of great concern to us. That slippery slope, where anti-Zionism became anti-Semitism, which began more than 20 years ago, was famously recognized at a special meeting on anti-Semitism convened by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, in a speech by then U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, who said, and I quote, "It is not anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel, but the line is crossed when Israel or its leaders are demonized or vilified, for example, by the use of Nazi symbols and racist caricatures." That was the first time, and maybe imprecise now as we look back, might have been a little bit tighter, but it was the first time, really, that an international leader had spoken about this issue of criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism and where the line is drawn. But for many years, there are those who have hidden behind the legitimate criticism of Israel argument, but like the curtain in front of the Wizard of Oz torn down by Toto, that argument is no longer used by most of those in the anti-Zionist, anti-Israel camp. It's there for all to see. We now call it delegitimization, and it is seen everywhere. Who's engaging in this phenomenon? BDSers who call Israel a new apartheid South Africa, by those in the European Union and international church groups who call for the boycott of Israeli products, and yet insist that it's not a boycott, by those in the United Nations Human Rights Council who only weeks ago amassed a list of Israeli companies to boycott, by the UN's own Special Rapporteur on Palestine, a position created only to castigate Israel, who specifically called for an economic boycott of Israel, by the UNESCO Executive Board, including, among other countries, France, who have sought to erase Jewish and Christian history in Jerusalem. And even by the World Health Organization, previously unpoliticized, which last year adopted a resolution criticizing Israel for impeding the delivery of healthcare services to Palestinians in the territories, a vicious calumny, a blood libel, if you will, it's the World Health Organization, supported by 107 countries, including all of the European countries present. That despite the full knowledge that Israeli hospital emergency rooms, for example, treat all patients according to the severity of their injuries, or the existence of Save a Child's Heart, an organization that has performed thousands of pediatric heart procedures on Palestinian and other children from the Arab and Islamic world. Shame on them at the World Health Organization. So with that as a backdrop, where does Zionism, Israel, Jewish identity, and anti-Semitism interact? To understand that, we need first to look at ourselves. The differences that were always present in the Zionist movement have lapped over sometimes into our own community. Divisiveness has now oftentimes replaced differences. Maybe it's the emergence of Startup Nation, of a militarily strong Israel, or the appearance that Israel's neighbors are in a state of interreligious disarray. Maybe it's frustration over the unfulfilled expectations of the Oslo Accords, the signing on the White House lawn. Maybe we feel confident enough to engage in being more divisive than usual, if you will. Well, when I last looked, there are reports of Iranian military bases being constructed in Syria. Hezbollah rules in Lebanon. The Shia land bridge from Iran to Iraq, Syria, and into Lebanon will see Iranian Revolutionary Guard operatives and Hezbollah terrorists in the foothills of the Golan Heights. Terrorists have more than set up shop in the Sinai. They are killing Egyptian troops on a daily basis. Yesterday, 55 Egyptian policemen were killed in an ambush in the Sinai. And Hamas, which purportedly signed a much acclaimed agreement with Fatah just days ago, has refused to disarm. It vows for the destruction of Israel, and that continues unabated. Perspective must be our first objective. Differences over serious and important issues must not cloud our thinking when it comes to the very real security challenges on all of Israel's borders and far beyond. We must find a way to find unity in an age of what appears to be long-term threats to the Zionist enterprise, and still have time for discussions. Vernon pointed out with great insight today, if you can't have a discussion about these issues, then why would we get together? Yet, we have, looming over everything else, these great security challenges which have not abated, despite the fact that Israel is strong and that Israel is a leader of the global stage in so many different areas. Well, interestingly, the Jewish world of 1913, in which my parents and my great-uncle professed their love for the idea of a Jewish state, was itself a time of upheaval, and for the Jews of Europe, a time of distress. But the promise of a place for us kept them focused. It kept them uplifted. We need badly to recapture that kind of solidarity, allowing for differences, which have always been a part of our Jewish existence. As Zionists, that is the challenge before us. It's not too late to take stock, to make the course corrections, and to work together towards what has brought us to this conference this week.